Death lottery at Devil's Anvil. Marshal Outlaw King and Apache bride collide in a deadly 1876 betrayal. The sun rose slowly over the rugged hills surrounding Devil's Anvil, casting long shadows across the dusty streets. The town itself seemed small, almost fragile, with wooden buildings that creaked in the dry wind. Smoke curled up from the chimneys of a few scattered homes, and the clatter of hooves on dirt roads echoed through the early morning calm. But beneath the quiet surface, the town was anything but peaceful. Every person in Devil's Anvil knew that trouble was never far away. Marshal James Caldwell walked steadily along the main street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of sun, wind, and difficult decisions. His eyes were sharp, always watching, always calculating. Caldwell had come to Devil's Anvil several years earlier, seeking work as a lawman in a place where law was more of a suggestion than a rule. Since then, he had earned a reputation as a fair but firm marshal, the kind of man who could keep order without relying solely on his gun. Still, he knew that even the most respected lawman could not stop every threat that wandered into town. The townspeople moved about their morning routines, glancing at Caldwell as he passed. Shopkeepers swept the porches of their stores, children chased each other between buildings, and miners made their way to the outskirts of town, ready for a long day of work. Despite the bustle, there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that something dangerous was approaching. Rumors had been circulating for weeks about a man named Jackson Kane, known by many as the Iron Hand. He was an outlaw with a fearsome reputation, said to be as clever as he was cruel. Stories of his daring robberies and brutal escapes had spread across the Arizona territory, and Devil's Anvil, with its small silver mines and scattered wealth, seemed like the perfect place for him to strike next. Caldwell knew that Kane's arrival was inevitable. Outlaws like him didn't wander aimlessly. They followed opportunity, and they left destruction in their wake. The marshal had spent the past few days preparing the town as best he could. David spoke quietly with the shopkeepers, reminding them to lock their doors and protect their valuables. He had visited the saloon, warning the owner not to allow Kane's men to gather there and spread fear among the locals. Still, he felt a knot of unease tighten in his stomach. Even with careful planning, there were no guarantees against someone as unpredictable as Kane. As Caldwell continued his patrol, a new figure appeared on the horizon, moving swiftly across the hills. She was unlike anyone he had seen in Devil's Anvil before. Her skin was a warm, copper tone, her dark hair flowing freely in the wind. There was a strength and confidence in the way she moved, a silent command of her surroundings. Her name was Nayeli, and she was an Apache woman whose past was shrouded in mystery. Those who had glimpsed her in town whispered about her beauty and intelligence, but there was more to Nayeli than anyone could guess. She had her own reasons for traveling through the territory, reasons tied to loyalty, survival, and the promise of justice. Nayeli had been following the rumors of Jackson Kane as well. She had learned of his violent tendencies and the fear he spread wherever he went. But unlike the townspeople, Nayeli was not simply afraid. She was determined. She knew the land, the trails, and the hidden places where one could travel unseen. Her skills in tracking, survival, and strategy made her a formidable figure, though she had no desire for conflict unless it became absolutely necessary. Her journey to Devil's Anvil was guided by instinct and by the hope that she could influence the outcome of events before too much harm was done. Meanwhile, Kane himself was making his way toward the town, unaware that both Caldwell and Nayeli were already moving in response to his arrival. Kane had a reputation for reading people quickly, understanding their weaknesses, and using them to his advantage. He had spent years surviving in the harsh frontier, escaping lawmen and building a network of followers who would do anything for him. Devil's Anvil represented opportunity, silver, supplies, and a chance to assert his power in a new territory. He rode with quiet confidence, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. As the morning progressed, the tension in Devil's Anvil became more noticeable. Farmers paused in their work to glance nervously down the roads. Children stopped playing when they heard the sound of distant hooves. Shopkeepers peeked from behind windows, hoping to catch a glimpse of the approaching outlaw. Caldwell, walking steadily along the main street, could feel the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. Every decision he made, Every warning he gave could mean the difference between life and death for the people he had sworn to protect. He stopped outside the sheriff's office, a modest building made of weathered wood. Inside, maps and notes were spread across a desk, showing the surrounding hills, nearby trails, and possible escape routes. Caldwell studied the maps carefully, tracing lines with his finger, imagining every possible scenario in which Kane might strike. He thought about the townspeople he had come to know, about the families who relied on him, and about the harsh reality of life on the frontier, where danger could appear without warning. By midday, Nayeli had reached the outskirts of the town. She moved silently, blending with the landscape, observing the small clusters of houses and businesses. Her instincts told her that Kane's arrival was imminent, and she began thinking about how she could intervene without putting innocent lives at risk. She remembered stories from her people about betrayal and honor, and she knew that trust would be a fragile and precious thing in the coming days. Her mind raced with possibilities, each choice carrying serious consequences. As the sun climbed higher, a sense of anticipation settled over Devil's Anvil. The wind picked up, scattering dust across the streets and carrying the distant sound of hooves. Caldwell paused in the center of town, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. He could see the shimmer of heat waves on the hills, the faint outline of a rider in the distance. His hand rested near the holster of his revolver, not because he wanted to draw it, but because he knew the time for careful planning was almost over. The townspeople continued with their routines, unaware of how close danger had come. In the saloon, a few men played cards and shared quiet conversation, their laughter masking the growing fear beneath the surface. Outside, children ran in circles, chasing each other and laughing, oblivious to the shadows creeping closer. And yet, in the air, there was a sense of inevitability, a feeling that lives were about to collide in ways no one could fully predict. Marshal Caldwell knew that the coming days would test every skill he had learned as a lawman. He knew that courage alone would not be enough. He would need strategy, patience, and the ability to anticipate Kane's moves. At the same time, Nayeli, moving like a shadow on the outskirts, understood that her role would require careful observation and decisive action. Both of them were preparing for a confrontation that could change the future of Devil's Anvil forever. As evening approached, the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. The town grew quiet, the dust settling, the air heavy with anticipation. Caldwell walked back along the main street, checking doors and windows, speaking quietly to anyone he met. Nayeli found a vantage point on a nearby hill, watching the town and noting every detail. And somewhere beyond the hills, Jackson Kane moved closer, unaware that two determined and capable figures were already waiting for him, ready to meet the danger head-on. In Devil's Anvil, life seemed normal on the surface, but underneath, a storm was building. The collision of Marshal Caldwell, Jackson Kane, and Nayeli would soon begin, a test of courage, loyalty, and cunning that would leave no one unchanged. The summer of 1876 promised to be a turning point for the small town, a time when the quiet streets would become the stage for bravery, betrayal, and the harsh realities of frontier life. As night fell, a hush settled over Devil's Anvil. The windows reflected the fading light. The streets were empty except for the occasional patrol, and the distant hills seemed to hold their breath. Everyone knew that something was coming, but no one could say exactly what. The town waited, tense and uncertain, as the stage was quietly set for the events that would define the summer, a deadly collision that none of them would ever forget. The sun had just begun its climb over the desert hills when Jackson Iron Hand Kane rode closer to Devil's Anvil. Dust swirled around his horse's hooves, leaving a faint trail behind him. Kane was tall and lean, with a face that had seen more danger than most men could imagine. His eyes were sharp and calculating, always scanning, always measuring. He carried himself with quiet confidence, the kind of presence that could make a room or a town fall silent. Every man, woman, or child who had heard his name feared what he could do. Yet no one had ever truly seen the full extent of his power until it was too late. Kane's journey to Devil's Anvil had not been simple. He had spent weeks moving through the rugged terrain, avoiding patrols and scouting the towns in the Arizona Territory. He had heard stories of Marshal Caldwell, a lawman whose reputation for fairness had spread across the region. Some might have warned him that Caldwell could be dangerous, but Kane did not fear men who followed rules. He feared only weakness, and he had a plan to exploit the weaknesses he believed he would find in the town. Riding beside Kane, though slightly behind, was Nayeli. She moved with grace, her horse's steps silent compared to Kane's. Her face remained calm, but inside, a storm of thoughts raged. She had not fully trusted Kane from the beginning, yet she had followed him for reasons she could not easily explain. Nayeli understood the danger he posed not just to herself but to innocent people, and she knew that controlling his actions would require both courage and careful timing. Every decision she made could mean life or death for herself and for the town she had grown to care for. As the two approached Devil's Anvil, Kane's mind focused on opportunity. The town had silver mines, small businesses, and homes filled with possessions that could be taken. But he knew that brute force alone would not secure his plan. Kane relied on cunning, manipulation, and fear. He had already started recruiting a few of the desperate townsfolk along his path, promising them wealth and protection in exchange for loyalty. Some men, tired of hard work and struggling to survive, agreed without hesitation. Others, more cautious or honorable, refused, leaving Kane to mark them in his mind as potential obstacles. Marshal Caldwell had already sensed movement beyond the hills. He had spent the previous night preparing his limited forces, making sure the town's defenses were as strong as possible. He had stationed a few trusted townsmen at strategic points, familiarized himself with the terrain, and memorized the layout of the buildings in case of conflict. He also knew that Kane was clever. There would be no straightforward confrontation. Every action had to be calculated, every step planned carefully. The marshal felt a heavy weight of responsibility pressing on him, knowing that even a small mistake could lead to chaos and tragedy. Inside the town, life seemed normal at first glance. Shopkeepers opened their doors, calling greetings to neighbors and customers. Children ran along the dirt streets laughing and playing without knowing the danger approaching. Miners made their way to the outskirts to begin their work, carrying picks and shovels under the morning sun. Yet, a sense of unease hung in the air. People whispered quietly in the corners, discussing rumors of the outlaw and wondering how the lawman would handle him. The ordinary rhythms of life continued, but the shadow of fear had begun to stretch across every building and street. Kane observed all this from a distance, calculating how best to approach. He did not want to attack immediately. Rushing in without planning would be foolish. Instead, he chose to gather intelligence, watching the town from nearby ridges and listening to the conversations of anyone he could influence. He had an instinct for reading people, knowing when fear or greed could be turned to his advantage. And as he studied the town, he began to form a strategy, a plan that would require both boldness and patience. Nayeli, however, did not share Kane's confidence. She could see the harm he could bring, and her instincts screamed that time was running out. While Kane plotted, she began noting possible ways to intervene. She studied the streets, the alleyways, and even the outskirts where civilians might flee if violence erupted. She observed the townspeople from the shadows, learning who might be persuaded, who could be warned, and who might need protection. Her understanding of the land, combined with her knowledge of human behavior, made her a crucial counterforce to Kane's plan, though she had to be careful not to reveal her intentions too soon. Meanwhile, Marshal Caldwell had begun reaching out to those he trusted. A few miners and shopkeepers agreed to follow his guidance, though many were hesitant to get involved directly. Caldwell knew that loyalty could be fragile, especially under pressure, so he focused on building a network of allies who could act quickly if danger arrived. He spoke calmly, reassuring the townsfolk that there was hope and that careful preparation could save lives. Yet even as he worked, he could not ignore the growing tension that seemed to hover over every street and building. As the sun rose higher, Kane made his first move. He sent a small group of men into town disguised as travelers or merchants. Their purpose was simple: to gather information and assess the town's defenses. They moved cautiously, asking questions, listening to conversations, and watching Caldwell's patrols. The townspeople, still caught in their routines, paid little attention to the strangers, but Nayeli noticed them immediately. Her eyes followed their every movement, her mind analyzing their behavior. She realized that these men were not ordinary travelers. They were Kane's eyes and ears, sent to prepare the way for his arrival. That afternoon, Kane approached even closer. He could now see the main street, the clusters of buildings, and the townspeople moving about. He felt a thrill, a mixture of anticipation and confidence. The challenge of taking control of Devil's Anvil excited him, but he also knew the risks. Marshal Caldwell was competent, and Naeli's presence complicated matters. Kane respected caution in his enemies, though he had no intention of letting it stop him. Every detail mattered: the positions of buildings, the habits of the townsfolk, the possible routes of escape. Naeli, aware of Kane's proximity, decided to act. She could not confront him directly yet, but she began planting subtle warnings and distractions. She moved along the outskirts, leaving signs that someone was watching, creating small obstacles that would slow Kane's men without revealing herself. Her actions were deliberate, measured, and risky, but she understood that every advantage mattered. Naeli had faced danger before, and she knew that her careful planning could make the difference between life and death for many innocent people. As evening approached, the first confrontation seemed inevitable. Kane's men had returned to their leader, reporting their findings and suggesting the best approach for the next day. Kane listened quietly, absorbing every detail, nodding occasionally and refining his plan. He knew that patience would be key. A premature attack could alert Caldwell and ruin everything, but the excitement of being so close to his target made it difficult to wait. He had spent too long on the run, planning, surviving, and striking opportunistically. Devil's Anvil represented both a challenge and a reward. Meanwhile, Marshal Caldwell prepared his town for what might come. He instructed his few trusted allies to remain vigilant, to protect families, and to maintain positions where they could observe the town from safety. Caldwell walked the streets himself, checking doors, windows, and hidden corners. He was aware that Kane was near, and he understood that any misstep could have terrible consequences. He also knew that someone else, a silent and unseen ally, was helping from the shadows. Naeli's influence was subtle but critical, and Caldwell sensed that the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place. Night fell over Devil's Anvil, and the desert air grew cool. The sky turned shades of deep orange and purple as stars began to emerge. Kane's presence was felt everywhere, though no one had yet seen him directly. The townspeople were anxious, sensing danger but unable to pinpoint it. Caldwell, ever vigilant, continued his patrols, aware that the next day could bring violence and betrayal. Naeli remained hidden, watching, ready to intervene at the right moment. The town seemed quiet, but beneath the surface, currents of fear, tension, and anticipation ran deep. In the distance, the hills beyond the town held the promise of confrontation. Kane was ready to make his move, confident in his skills and the loyalty of those who followed him. Caldwell was prepared to protect his people, knowing that courage and strategy would be needed in equal measure. Naeli, caught between loyalty, survival, and justice, would play a role that could tip the balance. Devil's Anvil, a quiet town under the desert sun, stood on the brink of chaos, its fate resting on the choices of three determined figures. The stage was set. The collision of Marshal Caldwell, Jackson Kane, and Naeli was no longer just a possibility. It was inevitable. Every step they took, every choice they made, would lead toward a confrontation that none of them could avoid. And as the night deepened, the town held its breath, waiting for the moment when courage, cunning, and loyalty would be tested in the unforgiving landscape of the American frontier. Naeli had spent the night under the shadow of a large rock formation just outside Devil's Anvil. The stars above shone brightly, but their beauty did little to ease the tension she felt in her chest. She had been traveling for weeks, moving quietly through the rugged terrain, following the trail of Jackson Kane. She had watched him from a distance, studying his movements and learning his patterns. She knew he was dangerous, not just because of his gun or his reputation, but because of his mind. Kane was clever, unpredictable, and ruthless, and he had no regard for anyone who stood in his way. Yet Naeli was not afraid. Fear had a purpose, she reminded herself, and it was a tool she could use if she stayed careful. She had faced dangers far greater than Kane before, though few had been as close to so many innocent lives at stake. She thought of the townspeople in Devil's Anvil, families who had no idea of the danger approaching, children laughing in the streets, and shopkeepers trusting strangers they did not fully know. They had no idea that their lives were about to intersect with Cain's violence and cunning. Nayeli felt a deep responsibility. She could not ignore what she had seen. She could not stay on the sidelines. Her mind drifted briefly to her past, to a life she had left behind. Nayeli had been promised to a tribal leader in her youth, a tradition that had bound her to a future she had never wanted. She had escaped, seeking freedom and autonomy, and had learned to survive in the harsh landscapes of the Southwest. Her people had taught her skills that were now invaluable: tracking, understanding the behavior of others, reading the signs of danger, and using the land to her advantage. These lessons had saved her many times, and she knew they would serve her now. But Nayeli's knowledge was not only practical, it was moral. She believed in justice and in protecting those who could not protect themselves. She had watched Cain destroy towns and manipulate people, and she understood that if he succeeded in Devil's Anvil, many innocent lives would be ruined. Nayeli's loyalty was complex. She owed allegiance to her people and to her own code of honor. Yet she felt a pull toward the small town and the people struggling to live ordinary lives. Her presence here was both a choice and a necessity. As dawn approached, Nayeli began to move closer to the town, using the shadows and natural cover to remain unseen. She paused to observe the streets and the buildings, noting the positions of potential threats. Her eyes scanned the windows, doorways, and alleys, creating a mental map of the town in her mind. She considered how Cain might enter, where his men might hide, and how the townspeople could be warned without causing panic. Every detail mattered. One mistake could cost lives. Nayeli's thoughts returned to Cain. He was not just an outlaw, he was a strategist. She had seen him manipulate others, and she knew that his plans were rarely simple. Cain relied on fear and the weaknesses of those around him, and he would exploit every opportunity to his advantage. Nayeli had to anticipate his moves, but she also had to remain flexible. Cain could be unpredictable, and she could not allow herself to be trapped by rigid plans. Her strength lay in adaptability, in understanding both human nature and the land around her. In the town itself, Marshal Caldwell continued his preparations. He had spoken with the miners and shopkeepers, forming a network of trusted allies who could act quickly if Cain made his move. Caldwell walked the streets, observing, listening, and making small adjustments to his plan. He was aware that Cain was close, though he did not yet know the full extent of the outlaw's strategy. He felt a growing sense of urgency, a recognition that the coming hours would test every skill he had developed as a lawman. The safety of the town rested on his judgment, and he could not afford to falter. By mid-morning, Cain had begun to take action. He sent a small group of men to explore the outskirts of the town, probing for weaknesses and observing the positions of Caldwell's allies. These men moved quietly, asking questions under the guise of curiosity, noting the locations of important buildings, and testing the resolve of anyone they encountered. Cain himself remained on a distant ridge, watching their movements and refining his approach. He was patient, confident that the town would reveal its weaknesses if observed carefully. Nayeli noticed the movements of Cain's men immediately. She recognized their behavior, their subtle signals, and the way they tried to blend in with the ordinary townsfolk. She understood that their mission was reconnaissance, meant to prepare the way for a larger attack. Nayeli began to plan her own actions. She could not confront them directly, at least not yet, but she could create distractions, slow their progress, and mislead them. She moved along the hidden paths near the outskirts, leaving small signs that someone was watching, creating subtle obstacles that would frustrate Cain's plans without revealing her presence. Her efforts required careful timing and precision. Nayeli understood the psychology of fear and uncertainty, and she used it to her advantage. She created sounds that suggested movement where there was none, left faint tracks that led in misleading directions, and positioned herself so that Cain's men would hesitate before taking action. Every step was calculated. Every decision weighed against the risk to innocent lives. Nayeli felt the weight of responsibility more keenly than ever. She could not allow Cain to gain the upper hand. Inside Devil's Anvil, the townspeople began to sense that something was amiss. Shopkeepers noticed strangers lingering. Miners reported unusual movements on the hills, and a quiet tension spread through the streets. Children were kept closer to home, and families spoke in hushed tones about the rumors of Kane's approach. Marshal Caldwell remained calm, though his mind was constantly working, anticipating every possible scenario. He understood the fear, but he also knew that panic could be just as dangerous as Kane himself. His role was to guide, protect, and act decisively when the time came. As the day wore on, Nayeli moved closer to the center of town, carefully observing Caldwell's positions and the habits of the townspeople. She recognized that their safety depended on her knowledge and her subtle interventions. She noted the locations of vulnerable families, the paths that Kane's men might take, and the potential choke points where a small force could hold off a larger one. Nayeli had seen how chaos could be manipulated, and she intended to use that understanding to keep the town safe without exposing herself to unnecessary danger. Kane, meanwhile, was growing impatient. The initial reconnaissance had provided useful information, but he wanted more certainty before committing to a larger plan. He studied the town from a distance, noting the patterns of movement, the distribution of allies, and the behavior of Marshal Caldwell. He respected Caldwell's abilities, recognizing that a straightforward attack would be costly. Kane's mind worked constantly, imagining scenarios, considering contingencies, and calculating risks. Every move he made was part of a larger strategy, a game in which he believed he could outwit everyone around him. But Nayeli's presence complicated his calculations. She moved unseen, creating obstacles, introducing uncertainty, and protecting those who might otherwise fall victim to Kane's plans. He sensed that someone was interfering with his progress, though he could not identify her. This uncertainty frustrated Kane, and it forced him to slow his plans, reassess his approach, and consider alternatives he had not anticipated. Nayeli's influence, quiet and invisible, was beginning to shape the events in ways he did not yet fully understand. By late afternoon, the tension in Devil's Anvil was nearly palpable. The sun cast long shadows across the streets, highlighting the wooden buildings and narrow alleys. Marshal Caldwell continued his patrols, checking positions, giving instructions, and preparing for whatever might come. Nayeli moved in silence, observing, protecting, and guiding without revealing herself. Kane's presence was felt everywhere, a dark energy pressing on the town, testing the courage, loyalty, and skill of all who lived there. As evening approached, Nayeli found a quiet place to rest briefly, crouched behind a large boulder with a clear view of the town. She reflected on the day's events, considering the next steps. She knew that a direct confrontation was still days away, but the decision she made now would shape that encounter. Every subtle action, every misdirection, every warning she gave to the townspeople could mean the difference between life and death. Nayeli understood that she was walking a fine line, balancing strategy, morality, and personal risk in a high-stakes situation. Night fell over Devil's Anvil, and the desert air grew cool and still. The stars appeared again, casting a faint glow over the hills and streets. Kane retreated to a hidden position to plan his next move. Frustrated by the unexpected resistance and uncertainty, Marshal Caldwell made his rounds, ensuring that the town remained alert and prepared. Nayeli remained in the shadows, watching, listening, and calculating. Her mind focused on the coming days and the inevitable confrontation that would test the courage, intelligence, and loyalty of everyone involved. The stage was set for events that would change the town forever. Nayeli's past, her skills, and her moral code had positioned her as a critical force in the unfolding drama. Kane's cunning and ruthlessness had made him a dangerous adversary. Marshal Caldwell's experience and dedication had given the town a chance to survive. The collision of these three lives, each driven by their own motives, would soon erupt into a conflict that would test every character to their limits. And in the quiet of the desert night, the people of Devil's Anvil remained unaware of how close they were to the storm. The morning sun rose over Devil's Anvil with an almost cruel brightness, as if it were shining directly on the tension that had gripped the town. The dusty streets, once quiet, now seemed ready to explode with the coming storm. Marshal James Caldwell walked along the main street, his eyes sharp, his hand resting near his holster, not for immediate use, but as a reminder to himself and to anyone watching that he was prepared. The town had been uneasy for days, ever since the rumors of Jackson Kane's approach began to circulate. Now, with the outlaw drawing closer, The unease had turned into a tense, almost suffocating anxiety. Caldwell had gathered his small group of trusted townsfolk the night before. Miners, shopkeepers, and a few ranchers had agreed to follow his instructions if Kane attacked. Each person understood the gravity of the situation, yet fear lingered beneath their willingness to help. Caldwell spoke quietly to them now, reminding them to stay calm, to act as one, and to protect the townspeople above all else. He knew that courage alone would not be enough. Strategy and timing would decide who survived the day. At the edge of town, Nayeli watched from the shadows. She had spent the night observing Kane and his men. They were more organized than she had expected, but not infallible. She could see that Kane had planned the attack carefully, using both intimidation and manipulation to strengthen his position. Nayeli knew that her role now was critical. She would need to guide Caldwell's forces, create distractions, and anticipate Kane's moves to prevent unnecessary bloodshed. She felt a steady determination, knowing that the lives of innocent people depended on her decisions. As the morning progressed, Kane finally made his approach. He rode into view with a small group of men, confident and intimidating. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust, and the sound echoed across the quiet streets. Kane's presence alone caused a ripple of fear to pass through the town. Yet he did not charge in recklessly. He was calculating, observing, testing, and waiting for the perfect moment. He knew that Marshal Caldwell was capable, and he could sense that someone else was working against him. His frustration was growing, and with each passing hour his patience began to wear thin. Inside the town, the first signs of betrayal began to appear. One of the townsfolk, a man who had always seemed trustworthy, had secretly aligned himself with Kane. The man, motivated by greed and fear, had given Kane information about Caldwell's strategies, positions, and the town's defenses. Nayeli noticed subtle changes. A door left unlocked when it shouldn't have been, a miner acting nervously near a supply store, and unusual movements that suggested someone was feeding Kane information. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Betrayal was often more dangerous than any enemy at the gate. Marshal Caldwell, unaware of the full extent of the betrayal, continued his patrols and prepared for confrontation. He had confidence in his planning and in the loyalty of most of the townsfolk, but he could feel something was off. His instincts told him that not everything was as it seemed. The tension in the town had shifted. There was a subtle uncertainty, a hesitation in the movements of some people, a fear that bordered on suspicion. Caldwell tightened his grip on his revolver, aware that the coming hours would test every ounce of his skill and judgment. Kane's men began to spread out across the town, probing defenses and testing reactions. They moved with the precision of trained soldiers, though their confidence sometimes bordered on recklessness. Kane observed from a safe distance, adjusting instructions and keeping a careful eye on both the townsfolk and Marshal Caldwell. He could sense the presence of an unseen adversary, someone smart enough to interfere with his plans without revealing themselves. This realization frustrated Kane but also made him more cautious, forcing him to refine his strategy. Nayeli acted swiftly to counter Kane's moves. She guided Caldwell's small force to strategic positions, using her knowledge of the land and the town's layout. She created distractions, misled Kane's men, and provided vital information to Caldwell without revealing herself directly. Her presence was subtle, like a shadow shaping events from behind the scenes. Every small victory mattered. Every delay she could introduce could save lives. Nayeli's actions were precise, deliberate, and courageous, yet she had to remain invisible. If Kane discovered her, the consequences could be fatal. The first skirmish occurred near the town's main supply store. Kane's men had attempted to secure valuable goods, but Nayeli's subtle interventions slowed their progress. Caldwell's allies, guided by her hints, were able to react quickly, holding key positions and protecting civilians. Gunfire rang out briefly, a harsh reminder that the town's fragile peace was gone. No lives were lost in this initial confrontation, but it was enough to make the stakes clear. Kane was serious, and the town's defenses, though prepared, were under real threat. As the day continued, Kane decided to escalate his actions. He aimed to sow confusion and fear, sending a larger group to flank the town from an unexpected direction. Nayeli had anticipated this possibility. She created obstacles, using fences, carts, and natural cover to slow their advance. She whispered instructions to Caldwell's allies, ensuring that everyone was in position to respond effectively. Her mind worked rapidly, calculating risks and predicting movements, aware that even one mistake could lead to catastrophe. The betrayal became more evident as Kane's men moved through the town. The insiders' information allowed them to bypass certain defenses and test the resolve of Caldwell's allies. Yet the townsfolk, guided by Caldwell's leadership and Nayeli's unseen influence, responded with surprising courage. They held their positions, defended their homes, and protected the people around them. The sense of betrayal was painful, but it also revealed the strength and determination of those who were loyal to the town. Kane, sensing resistance, grew more aggressive. He began taking greater risks, trying to intimidate the townsfolk and break their morale. He moved with precision, directing his men to exploit weaknesses while avoiding traps he suspected might be set. Nayeli stayed close to the action, observing and guiding, always staying just beyond Kane's view. She had learned that patience and careful planning could outweigh brute force. Her goal was to protect as many lives as possible while allowing Caldwell to maintain control of the situation. Marshal Caldwell's leadership shone through during the confrontation. He remained calm, issuing orders, reassuring the townsfolk, and coordinating defenses with a clear understanding of the terrain and the enemy's intentions. His experience as a lawman allowed him to anticipate Kane's moves and respond effectively. Even with the betrayal threatening to undermine their efforts, Caldwell's presence inspired confidence, keeping fear from turning into chaos. By late afternoon, the battle had reached its peak. Kane's men were pressing hard, testing every weakness, while Caldwell's allies held firm under intense pressure. Nayeli's interventions had slowed the outlaws, created confusion, and protected civilians, but the danger was far from over. The streets echoed with the sounds of movement, the whispers of strategy, and the tension of lives hanging in the balance. Every decision, every action, carried consequences that could not be undone. Finally, Kane made a bold move, attempting to seize control of the town's central area. He rode into the open, relying on intimidation and surprise to overpower the defenders. Nayeli had predicted this move. She signaled Caldwell's allies to flank him and created diversions that forced Kane to hesitate. The confrontation became a tense standoff, each side testing the other, neither willing to give ground. The townsfolk, once ordinary civilians, became participants in a struggle for survival, guided by Caldwell's leadership and Nayeli's careful planning. As evening approached, the battle began to shift. Kane's frustration grew as his plans met unexpected resistance. He realized that the betrayal alone was not enough to guarantee success. Nayeli's intelligence, Caldwell's leadership, and the courage of the townsfolk combined to create a formidable defense. Kane was forced to reconsider his options, weighing risks against potential gains and recognizing that a direct assault could lead to failure. Night fell over Devil's Anvil, bringing temporary calm, but leaving the threat unresolved. The town had survived the day, but at a cost. Trust had been broken. Fear lingered in the hearts of the people, and the presence of Kane remained a shadow over every street. Nayeli remained hidden, planning the next steps, understanding that the battle was not yet over. Marshal Caldwell moved through the streets, checking on his allies, comforting families, and preparing for what might come next. Kane retreated to plan his next move, frustrated but not defeated. The betrayal had revealed the complexity of human nature, the thin line between loyalty and self-interest, and the harsh realities of life on the frontier. Yet it had also revealed courage, intelligence, and the power of careful planning. Nayeli's presence, though unseen, had been pivotal, and Caldwell's leadership had ensured that the town held together under intense pressure. The events of this day would be remembered, shaping the lives of everyone involved and setting the stage for the final confrontation that would decide the fate of Devil's Anvil. Dawn broke over Devil's Anvil with a pale light that crept slowly across the dusty streets. The air was crisp and still, as if the town itself were holding its breath. The events of the previous day had left the townspeople exhausted, but resolute. They had faced betrayal, confusion, and the terrifying presence of Jackson Kane, yet they had survived. Now, the final confrontation was inevitable. Marshal James Caldwell moved along the main street, his eyes scanning every corner, every alley, every roof. He knew that Kane would not wait much longer. The outlaw's pride and ambition demanded a decisive action, and Caldwell was determined to meet it with courage and skill. Nayeli, hidden in the shadows atop a small ridge overlooking the town, studied the movements of Kane and his men. She had spent the previous night tracking their positions, noting every patrol route, and memorizing their numbers and weapons. Her strategy was simple yet daring. Guide Caldwell's forces, protect civilians, and turn Kane's own arrogance against him. Nayeli knew that Kane would not anticipate her subtle interventions, and she planned to use that advantage to shift the battle in favor of the town. Her heart beat steadily, but her mind was a whirlwind of calculation and anticipation. Kane appeared on the outskirts of the town just as the sun began to rise fully, his horse moving with quiet confidence. He had spent the night devising a plan that he believed would overwhelm Caldwell and secure the town's wealth for himself. He had also gathered intelligence from the townsfolk who had betrayed their neighbors, believing it would give him a perfect advantage. Yet as Kane rode closer, he could sense the invisible resistance that had frustrated him yesterday. Someone was countering his moves, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. He had never liked unknown variables, and Nayeli's hidden presence was one he could not yet identify. Caldwell stood at the center of the main street, his hand resting lightly on his revolver, but his mind focused on observation and strategy. His allies were positioned at key points, ready to act but instructed to avoid unnecessary risk. Families had been guided to safe locations, out of the line of fire, and the town's limited resources were strategically placed to allow for both defense and escape if needed. Caldwell's experience as a lawman, combined with his careful planning, gave the townspeople a rare sense of security amid chaos. Yet even he felt the weight of the coming confrontation, knowing that mistakes could be fatal. The first sign of movement came from Kane's men as they began to spread across the outskirts. Nayeli, watching from her vantage point, anticipated their route and signaled small distractions. Rocks tumbled down hillsides, small fires created illusions of presence, and sudden sounds drew the men's attention away from their intended path. Kane himself noticed the confusion, his frustration growing. He realized that his plan was not unfolding as smoothly as he had hoped. Nayeli's unseen hand was complicating matters, forcing him to improvise. The townspeople, under Caldwell's guidance, held their positions calmly. The initial skirmishes had tested their courage, and they had risen to the challenge. The previous day's betrayal had shaken them, but it had also strengthened their resolve. They knew that this confrontation would decide the future of their homes, their families, and their lives. Caldwell moved among them, giving quiet words of encouragement, reinforcing positions, and observing the enemy. His presence was a stabilizing force, a reminder that courage and careful planning could overcome even the most fearsome threat. Kane advanced further into town, his men spreading out to take control of key points. He relied on fear, his reputation, and the loyalty of his followers to intimidate and dominate. Yet Nayeli's subtle interventions continued to disrupt his progress. Small obstacles slowed his men, while carefully placed distractions misdirected their attention. Kane's frustration turned into anger, but he remained controlled, adjusting his strategy while unaware that an unseen adversary was shaping the battle from the shadows. The confrontation reached its peak near the town's main square. Kane attempted a bold move, hoping to seize control and break the morale of Caldwell's allies. He rode into the open, his presence commanding attention, and signaled his men to advance. The townspeople braced themselves, weapons at the ready, while Caldwell moved to intercept. Nayeli had anticipated this move. From her vantage point, she guided Caldwell's forces to positions that would allow them to flank Kane's men, creating a crossfire that Kane could not have predicted. Gunfire erupted, echoing across the town as Kane's men collided with Caldwell's defenders. Dust and smoke filled the streets, and the air was tense with the sounds of shouts, movement, and the occasional crack of a rifle. Nayeli remained hidden, observing the flow of the battle, signaling allies with subtle gestures, and adjusting her strategy as the situation evolved. Her calm presence and intelligence allowed Caldwell's forces to maintain coordination, even as Kane attempted to exploit perceived weaknesses. The betrayal from the previous day became critical during this moment. Kane's inside man tried to act, giving orders and attempting to manipulate positions for the outlaws' advantage. Yet Caldwell's planning and Naeli's guidance countered these efforts. The townsfolk, despite fear and exhaustion, stood firm. Every action Kane took was met with resistance, every maneuver carefully anticipated. Naeli's understanding of Kane's psychology allowed her to predict his next steps, turning the outlaw's aggression into a liability rather than an advantage. Kane, frustrated and enraged, tried to confront Caldwell directly. He rode into the center of the town, seeking to force a duel that would end the conflict in his favor. Caldwell met him calmly, not with blind courage, but with careful calculation. He had learned Kane's patterns, understood his tactics, and anticipated his aggression. The two men faced each other, eyes locked, neither willing to yield. Naeli used this moment to coordinate with Caldwell's allies, ensuring that Kane's men were contained and that the townsfolk remained safe. The final turning point came when Kane underestimated Naeli's role. She had positioned herself strategically, unseen by the outlaw, and guided Caldwell's forces to exploit Kane's momentary distraction. Kane's men found themselves trapped in positions they could not easily escape, while Caldwell and his allies pressed their advantage. Kane realized too late that his plan had failed, that his arrogance had blinded him to the presence of a skilled and clever adversary. The outlaw's reputation for invincibility crumbled under the combined force of Caldwell's leadership, Naeli's intelligence, and the courage of the townsfolk. By mid-morning, Kane was cornered. His options were limited, and the fight that had promised chaos and destruction had shifted decisively against him. Naeli revealed herself at the right moment, not with violence, but with precise action that ensured Kane could not escape. Caldwell moved forward, confronting Kane with the authority and determination that had guided him throughout the ordeal. The outlaw's fall was inevitable, the culmination of careful planning, bravery, and the unexpected influence of Naeli's unseen hand. With Kane defeated, the town slowly began to breathe again. The immediate danger had passed, but the consequences of the confrontation remained. Some buildings had been damaged, minor injuries occurred, and the memory of betrayal lingered. Yet the townspeople had survived, their homes and families intact. Caldwell moved through the town, checking on everyone, offering words of reassurance and reinforcing the bonds that had held the community together during the crisis. Naeli, her role revealed but respected, remained quietly vigilant, ensuring that no further threats emerged. In the days that followed, Devil's Anvil began to recover. The townspeople repaired damages, shared stories of courage and cleverness, and reflected on the lessons learned. Kane's presence had tested them in ways they had never imagined. Yet it had also revealed the strength, loyalty, and intelligence of those who chose to stand together. Naeli returned to her people, her mission complete, but leaving a lasting impression on the town. Her bravery and strategic thinking became part of the story of Devil's Anvil, a tale of courage and cunning in the face of overwhelming danger. Marshal Caldwell continued his role as protector and leader, forever marked by the events that had unfolded. He had faced betrayal, tested loyalty, and survived the cunning of one of the territory's most dangerous outlaws. Yet he also witnessed the unexpected power of cooperation, intelligence, and courage. The town of Devil's Anvil would remember the summer of 1876 as a turning point, a time when ordinary people, guided by skill and determination, faced extraordinary danger and emerged victorious. The story of Kane, Naeli, and Caldwell became part of the town's history, passed down through generations. Children grew up hearing about the bravery of the townsfolk, the cleverness of the Apache woman, and the steadfast leadership of the Marshal. The streets that had once echoed with fear now carried lessons of courage, trust, and the importance of standing together in the face of danger. Devil's Anvil survived not just because of strength or numbers, but because of the intelligence, bravery, and moral courage of those willing to fight for what was right. As the sun set over the hills, painting the sky with shades of orange and red, the town finally felt a sense of peace. The shadows of the previous battles faded, leaving behind lessons that would shape the future. Nayeli's journey continued beyond the town, her role in the story complete, but her influence lasting. Caldwell remained vigilant, aware that the frontier would always bring new dangers, but confident in the knowledge that courage, intelligence, and loyalty could overcome even the darkest threats. Devil's Anvil had survived the storm, and its people had proven that even in the harshest lands, bravery and wisdom could triumph.